So throughout the whole workshop, I think we've reiterated this plenty that Medicaid data presents some real challenges for use in research. Again, knowledge of state administration of the program is really, really crucial since it's a joint state federal program. That state variation can make a big difference, and you should be understanding um, each state, each year that you're studying, making sure you know what's going on with the population and what's covered. So that there's a lot to know for each year of data. The data structure is complex. We talked about how there are multiple segments in the demographic and eligibility file. People can have multiple records in different files. The utilization files are structured one-to-many with a header record and multiple records in the line file. And the data are large. There are many, many variables, many, many records. You have to make some really careful decisions when you're paring things down into the analytic files that you're using. So there's a lot of processing work to use the data. There are the regular challenges of using administrative data for research. Again, these data aren't generated for research, but they've been kind of co-opted for research. So it's really important to understand the original intent and purpose of the data before you use them. And then there are also challenges around submitting a data request. CMS needs really detailed information in the request materials, and we covered a lot of the items earlier, but for the rest of this presentation, I'll really be focused on that. Last item, there are challenges around submitting a request and what you need to know to help make that process go a little more smoothly. So there are many challenges with the CMS Medicaid research files, but they also definitely present an opportunity. So hopefully we didn't scare you. It's exciting. There's a lot of information that can be gleaned, and we're all learning. The data are national and not state specific, so there is some comparison possible to an extent. You don't have to worry about like cobbling together non-standardized data with state-specific codes. There's a lot of information that's gone into making these more accessible and more universal. And state variation can be useful in understanding the impact of programs. You can think about how different programs are being implemented as a type of experiment. So that's very promising. And we've also mentioned that Medicaid covers many, many people and many, many services. So there is a wealth of information, a lot of records, some service types, like we said, nursing homes and births. A lot of the majority of those may be covered by Medicaid. So there's a lot of data. And just to note, the federal government has used the TAF or the TMSIS data to look at things like substance use and service utilization through COVID-19 pandemic recently. So it's not just that they're getting released for research, but they are being used by CMS at the same time. I also want to note, I think there were some initial reactions to seeing the data quality atlas in multiple TAF releases. Like there are concerns, quality is a challenge, but I think it's promising. Data quality's been a major focus with the introduction of TMSIS, and I think awareness is better than ignorance. Max had a lot of the same problems, if not more. They might just not have been as obvious in the validation reports as they're presented in the TAF DQ Atlas. So I think TAF RIF are a really, really important research resource. I adapted this slide and the next from Beth Vernig's Medicare 101 presentation because I really liked them. A lot of the issues we see when we're reviewing requests at ResDAC can be avoided by thinking through things really carefully in the design phase. So if you're making a decision about whether Medicaid RIF are right for you, you should be thinking about whether your target population is covered by Medicaid. So Medicaid includes a lot of people, like we've said, but not everyone. It is a very specific group. So sometimes I see people saying things like they'll generalize the data to the national population, which isn't a good choice, probably. Another consideration, can your population of interest be identified in the CMS data? So maybe you're interested in something, but it's not lining up with what's included in the administrative data. And the same kind of follows for the content of the data. Are you looking at something that has representation within the data? Can you find your key outcome, explanatory, and control variables within the administrative data? And with some Medicaid requests, I've seen issues at ResDAC review where something is cited as central to a project, but it's not in the Medicaid data, something like biomarkers or lab results, that gets dropped in administrative data if it's not something that's influencing payment or service utilization that gets tracked by the state. Some other variables that people like to reference a lot but have known issues with completion or quality include decedents, which we already talked about. There are some limitations with death in the Medicaid research files in some states in some years. And then also tracking case groups or looking for linkages within some states, that can be a real challenge. So things to be thinking about when you're planning your project. So definitely know where the data originate, how they get there to help you understand kind of what you would expect to find and how well it can be used for your needs. So just the same reminder, CMS doesn't collect data for the purpose of research, but it's getting collected to administer CMS programs. Another good way to avoid problems during ResDAC and CMS review is to understand CMS's perspective on the release of CMS research identifiable files. So again, CMS is valuing research. These data are getting released through this well-established process, but research isn't the primary goal of CMS. The primary goal is administering the programs, and beneficiary privacy is a top priority more than research. So the concerns about identifiable data getting released are going to be kind of the focus of CMS review. Some other things to understand include that the data are released to institutions or organizations, so it's not going to a specific individual or principal investigator, the agreements between an organization and CMS. And then the data are released for a specific purpose that's subject to CMS approval. And that purpose must be research. So again, because these are identifiable data, they're subject to HIPAA and other federal regulations, and CMS RIF are released under a research release provision. So requests have to demonstrate that a proposed project qualifies as research. And CMS has kind of defined research as creation of generalizable knowledge. So when we're looking at a request and we're reviewing, we're kind of thinking about what CMS considers research and what's considered generalizable knowledge. So maybe you have data for a specific program or a specific clinic. Just focusing on that's not enough. There has to be kind of extension beyond that specific group. We're looking for creation of information about the association between things. So looking for things where you're testing a hypothesis about the role of or the association with things. And you can't just have methods, but you have to be applying methods. Finally, if you're an innovator or for-profit organization, if you're doing any tool or product development, it has to be secondary to the plan to use the data to answer a research question. And then from one of the request materials, the RIF application, CMS has said the study description, within the study description, to be approved under current CMS policy, the purpose of your study must be designed in a way that is expected to demonstrate the potential to improve the quality of life for CMS beneficiaries or improve administration of CMS programs. There's also a requirement in the RIF application to describe your plans for publicly disseminating your findings. So that's the other piece of that. Contributing to generalizable knowledge, are you making your findings publicly available? And they're pretty strict on that publication or dissemination requirement. The whole request process is designed to help CMS understand your project and how it meets their requirements. So of course, you know what's going on. You've been thinking about your study for a long, long time, but multiple people will be reviewing your request at CMS and they all have a different perspective. So it's a new audience. You should be thinking about what you want to characterize for CMS. Access to the research identifiable files requires submission of a formal request packet, and it goes through a phased review that includes ResDAC and CMS. And Nate mentioned this yesterday. We're reviewing requests with the intention to make sure they get approved by CMS. So we're not making any decisions, but we're making recommendations to make sure you meet CMS's expectations and they can review your request and they say, great, this is approved. That's the best path forward. ResDAC review is pretty dynamic and it has a few steps. It can be a little cyclical depending on the state of your request materials when they're submitted. There's a ResDAC administrative review with an executive advisor that looks for consistency between all the request materials and for compliance with CMS policy. And then there's ResDAC technical review with a technical advisor that's really focused on the research project, whether the project is feasible given the content of the CMS data, and if the data requested are consistent with the research question. And then a lot of that technical review is also kind of translating what a researcher needs for their work, what the data distributor does in their processes, and then CMS expectations. And then the purpose of CMS review, I took this from their RIF DUA policies document, but the purpose of CMS Privacy Board review is CMS Privacy Board reviews all potential disclosures of CMS RIF data for research purposes to ensure compliance with the requirements of HIPAA privacy rule, the Privacy Act of 1974, other applicable federal laws and regulations, and CMS data policies. So they're, again, looking to make sure that the research requirements met and they don't have any other concerns with their policies. The outcome of a successful data request means that you've established a data use agreement between your request organization and CMS where specific data have been approved for use in a specific study. So all of the request forms reflect this. You really need to describe a research question, match that question to the CMS data, and work hard to justify what you're requesting, including the files, years, and cohort. So I'll be walking through this list of important considerations for the RIF request process. Because they're identifiable, many elements of the request process are customizable and they're specific to your project. I think what makes review go well is to consider all options in advance and make sure you've made a choice before you've submitted a request instead of making choices along the way. Making those decisions can take a long time. So just knowing this information and making an informed decision is probably going to help you a lot in ResDAC review. So one element of a request is file years. So you have to justify each file year that's requested, and you should consider what's of interest and necessary for your study. The RIF customization process also includes enrollees or beneficiaries. So you're only supposed to be obtaining data for the fewest enrollees that allow you to conduct your study successfully. And there are many ways to identify that cohort that's going to be extracted for your project. At this time, there are also options for how you access the CMS data, so I'll talk about that. It's also good to anticipate the fees for accessing the research identifiable files. And then there's a distinct review process for data storage that's part of request review, so I'll also preview that. So that first item I want to talk about, files. You should think really carefully about what types of records that you're interested in. So what services would you like to observe? Part of that minimum data necessary requirement is providing strong justification for each file requested. So something shouldn't be listed in your request if it might be useful. We are really looking to see that you need it for your study. And we covered the Medicaid files yesterday, so I'm not going to name all of them again, but here's this list as a reminder. There are enrollment and utilization files. For TAF, there are also these plan and provider files. And then the Medicaid enrollee supplemental file, National Death Index, is a Medicaid specific file. And we've alluded to this, we haven't gone into a ton of detail, but the research identifiable files can all generally be used together. If someone's been identified with a Benny ID, that Benny ID is carried across all of the CCW delivered data. So you can follow people into the Medicare files or assessments. Those all have a CCW Benny ID. So definitely read the overview documentation for the files of interest to make a decision on whether they're needed. I'd also recommend reviewing data quality to make sure something's a good fit. When I'm reviewing a request, I think something that's really well prepared for CMS review has kind of provided a study description, listed aims and objectives, and then connected those aims and objectives to the CMS data really carefully. Kind of that high-level justification can be really helpful later when you're doing file-specific descriptions. You don't have to do as much detail within each specific file. You can kind of pull out the details that are relevant instead of kind of the, oh, of course we're interested in utilization. And cohort selection is also very, very important. It's a unique feature of RIF requests. It's the other part of adherence to the CMS RIF DUA's minimum data necessary requirement. I think it's probably the most challenging part of technical review. So there's not just you have to do the work to figure out what cohort meets your needs, but you also have to make sure it's consistent with the data extraction process. And that's always a challenge to get those two things aligned. To start, data processing happens in 2 steps. So you aren't picking specific records of interest. Say you want every claim with this procedure, it's not how the data get extracted. First, you flag individuals of interest, and then you ask for all of their records in the requested file years. And this process was really designed for Medicare data. I think that's helpful context. It makes a lot of sense that, oh, you flag someone, they're generally going to stay in the program and you can follow their utilization longitudinally across many years, across many service types. Max data were originally requested by state, so that's pretty different than this getting a custom cohort based on your own criteria. So that's something I think that helps explain why the process is set up that way. There are 2 different options for identifying a custom cohort. You might hear these referred to as finder file or custom cohort option 1 and option 2. The first option involves flagging specific individuals. So this can be used if you are able to provide a numeric identifier list to the data distributor. For Medicare, there are quite a few options. There's the health insurance claim number, or HIC, the older identifier, the Medicare beneficiary ID, or MBI, or the social security number. For Medicaid, it's a little more restricted, but the most common option accepted by the data distributor is social security number. So if you actually have a list of specific individuals you're interested in studying, you can provide identifiers to the data distributor and they can extract data for that group. Option 2 for custom cohort identification is a little different. You're identifying a group of people that meet criteria. And for this option, you have to provide the instructions for searching specific file years, specific variables for specific values in order to kind of pare down to the group appropriate for your study. For that first option where you're providing identifiers, I think it's really important to know that the data distributor has strict matching requirements. So you can't just say, oh, I think like this group, can you do some probabilistic matching? It's not that flexible. It's pretty set. They have something in a finder file encryption policy that I recommend reviewing if you have questions about that. For that second option, I think there's a big balance between cohort complexity and minimum data necessary. You don't want to unintentionally exclude people, but you want to make sure you're meeting that minimum data necessary requirement. For Medicaid studies, I've seen a few issues pretty consistently with cohort identification. One is that process was designed, I think, for Medicare. So just because you're identifying someone as part of the cohort when you're searching multiple years of data, that doesn't mean they'll have a record in each file year, especially with the enrollment disenrollment patterns that we know are present in the Medicaid population. Another challenge is that there aren't any national sample data. So we're really hesitant to say that any sample is nationally representative because Medicaid is so unique to states. It's really many different programs instead of a national program. So it's possible that you could maybe draw a random sample for 1 year. You say search this year randomly reduced to this many people. That can represent a random sample for that year. But if you want to follow those people, it's hard to kind of add on to that and make it a sample that encompasses multiple years. There isn't the same longitudinal random standard samples like there are for Medicare that are based on digits in the social security number. One other issue I've seen with Medicaid projects is a lot of people are really interested in looking at family units, case groups, birthing parent and infant linkages. That can be used in your analysis, but the data distributor won't use that case number or case group variable in cohort identification. That custom cohort option 2 is really designed to identify groups of people, so it can't be used for any individual level matching to pull or flag people as part of your cohort. Again, I think cohort identification is probably the hardest part of the RIF request process. Files are relatively intuitive, whereas cohort identification is pretty unique to the CMS research identifiable files, or at least this extraction process that you have to meet before you get your hands on the data. As a reminder, with the Medicaid data specifically, you should be thinking very carefully about how states are administering their program, kind of who's included, how can they be identified, how will their services be recorded. If it's very easy to drop people unintentionally and not know it with your steps. A lot of the resources I discussed yesterday in segment 5 will support the cohort identification process. You can get a lot of summary data to see kind of eligibility enrollment counts by state. I want to revisit one, the CCW pricing tool. Because cohort impacts fees, this tool is designed to help with rough cohort count estimates. So they have some preset variable options for input where you can do kind of a simple search to output a rough beneficiary count. Most likely this won't be your final cohort, especially since it's based on 1 year, but I do think it's helpful to identify issues. If you have a specific diagnosis of interest, you can input it, and if there aren't any recipients, it's probably a limitation. You can't proceed with your study as originally planned. You can also get an understanding of maybe a group that contains the group that you're interested in. The next consideration for RIF requests that I'll be talking about is data access. And this, I think, was the first question yesterday. Many of you are aware CMS has announced their intent to update the research identifiable file release policies and discontinue distribution of physical data. So at this time, CMS is considering feedback that you all have provided. We don't have any information on plan implementation or timeline other than CMS pushed out the implementation to 2025 at least. So I'm going to be describing the options that are currently available. Right now, you can access the CMS RIF through 2 means of access. One, the virtual research data center. That's the option that researchers will be expected to move to if CMS's intended policy goes through, or it's also called the VRDC. I'll be saying the VRDC. This is virtual access through an environment maintained by the data distributor. So this is available to all types of requesting organizations. Security is inherited from the system. Your project gets set up, you have a dedicated project space, you have analysts that access the data, you do your analysis in the VRDC, and then the information that comes out is summary aggregated results that meet CMS publication requirements. So VRDC is a good option for a lot of people, especially with that built-in security. The other option is physical receipt. That's permitted at this time. This involves shipment of a hard drive. It's available to academic, nonprofit, and government agencies only. So for-profit organizations cannot receive physical data. The environment that hosts the data has to go through the data privacy safeguard program. There's a process to review data management plans for physical data that gets added to the request process if you're getting physical data receipt. Because RIF projects are so customizable, the fees are very, very specific to your study. The means of access are what sets the schedule. So I just described VRDC versus physical. That VRDC environment that's maintained by CCW is the prices are set with annually renewable fees for each project or data use agreement study, and then each analyst or seat holder that accesses the space. And that seat holder is a specific individual. They've gone through identity proofing. You can't share a seat. So both a project or a DUA and seats are both annually renewable. Seats kind of really set the bulk of VRDC fees, but there are other components of a request, choices that you make that can impact pricing. There are analytic choices. So there's something called the full VRDC with Databricks. Databricks has a notebook that can use multiple programming languages like R, Python, SQL. There's also an analytic container that applies to a seat that has additional software licenses like Stata, and it also includes RStudio. The default in the VRDC is SAS. That's not considered an add-on. So there's a fee for analytic container for each seat holder. Full VRDC with Databricks changes the fees for the project and the seat holder, and then also includes kind of a consumable component where when you're doing your analysis, it uses Databricks credits. There are also add-on fees for space. Space is used by the data extracted for your project, everything that's been approved by CMS, extracted for your project and saved in your VRDC project space that contributes to space. And then any analytic files or output that you create and are saving in your VRDC space contribute to space fees. And there's kind of a default amount included in the project, and then additional space might be required depending on your selections. Physical data are priced pretty differently. For each extract, there's kind of a fee for volume. So there's a fee for each file year by cohort size, and then there can be an additional finder file fee to go through the processing or programming to identify that beneficiary list. And depending on how simple or complex that identification process is, there can be a simple or complex finder file fee. And again, that CCW pricing tool I was talking about, the study size estimator a lot, but there's a secondary component. There's a pricing page that's a resource to help with physical data pricing. So once you have a cohort size estimate, you can select file years and get a rough estimate of how much your data will cost based on the cohort size and the file years that you would like to request. So although all fees are project specific, this is especially important for Medicaid requests. There's a little more that goes on with these files, as we've learned. You might recall this max TAF matrix from earlier. Because file is a component of pricing, I just wanted to note that there are some years with a combination of max and TAF. And if you are requesting data for these years, it's good to be aware of kind of which states you're including and which fees apply. So if you're getting a combination of states that include max and TAF data, the maximum amount you would have to pay is the TAF fees. You don't have to kind of double pay for max and TAF, but if you're only getting max fees, or if you're only getting max data, the max fees apply. And the max T are subject to the max fees because they do match that max format. And then in general, it's just a good reminder that you should think through your file year selection really carefully. If you're familiar with TAF, you might want to be very considerate about whether max are a good fit with this kind of by year, by state change. Another issue specific to the TAF RIF is the nature of data and possible releases. We got some questions about this yesterday, and I think it's a pretty common question on our help desk. Starting with 2019 data, CMS has been releasing a preliminary version of the TAF RIF. And these data aren't considered mature, but they have been released because CMS knows researchers are interested in obtaining the data kind of as soon as possible. These aren't considered mature. They are created with at least 6 months of run out from the end of the year, which means there's time allowed for processing, kind of reconciling the Medicaid program with providers, getting those bills paid, but then also Medicaid submitting TMSIS records to CMS for the TMSIS TAF data. So there are kind of multiple phases of this run out that have to be considered. So these have at least 6 months of run out for the year, but they aren't up to 12, which is the point at which the data are considered mature. The preliminary data are always followed by at least one mature release, and that would be known as release 1. Besides that, any TAF file year may be updated. So we've learned that TAF data are created using state submitted data from TMSIS, and states are continuing to work with CMS on data quality issues. If there are significant improvements, there might be enough to warrant an updated TAF RIF release. I think I have this chart of the different releases historically. CMS has released a second fully mature release for the 2014 through the 2018 data, and they could for any year of TAF. I know this schedule can really impact projects for physical data because the fees are assigned to each extract. If you request a new release of the same file year, it does incur a fee. If it's in support of the same projects, you're using the same cohort, it's the same year of data, the only thing that's changing is release, the fees reduced by 50% if you've already obtained data for a previous release. For VRDC projects, extracted data are not automatically updated. So if you have a custom cohort and it's been extracted in the VRDC, with each release, you have to submit an amendment request to initiate data processing to obtain those data, but there isn't a fee for running that kind of updated data extract that falls within the project fees. 100% data in the VRDC are treated a little differently. For 100% data, if you're approved, if you can say this is absolutely the minimum data necessary for my project, I've justified 100%. Those data don't get extracted into your project space. So those don't get counted for your project. You're actually approved for the year. And then those, you're accessing pre-extract libraries. Those get updated automatically. So you would receive a little notification from the CCW team that they're running an update and those libraries will get updated. I think that presents its own challenges. If you're using a specific release, you'd kind of have to save things into your own project folder. But there is that benefit of you don't have to worry about having the most up-to-date release. It's been approved. We recommend reviewing the data quality information for the most current release to see that the data available meet your needs. We don't really have a set schedule for TAF like there is for Medicare fee-for-service claims. That's on a pretty regular schedule. We know that there's at least 12 months of run out. The data are ready about 14 or 13 months after the last service date, the end of the year. That's ready to go. We have a request date in advance of when the data are ready to get all those requests processed. But for Medicaid, pretty much we know once the decision's been made and the data are ready for extract because the timing of all that processing takes a long time and it's hard to predict. The final item on the list of considerations I shared is privacy and security of data. So I've mentioned the data distributor is a CMS contractor, ResDAC's a CMS contractor. There's another CMS contractor involved in the RIF request process known as the Data Privacy Safeguard Program, or DPSP. They review data management plans. So all data use agreements with physical receipt have to be attached to an approved data management plan self-attestation questionnaire, or DMP-SAQ. This has replaced project-specific DMPs. So the DMP-SAQ covers a whole data storage environment, and it can be used across DUAs. The ResDAC site has resources from the Data Privacy Safeguard Program about DMP-SAQ expectations. And then I just wanted to note that the DMP-SAQ does require an annual renewal to say the same requirements are still being met. Okay, I've gone through all the considerations. Once you've planned your study, confirm that the CMS data match your project, identified the data that are appropriate for your project, and work to limit to the minimum data necessary, and you figured out how you're going to access the data and meet requirements, I think then you're ready to complete the DUA request forms. And hopefully all that preceding information can help you fill out those forms. Once prepared, draft forms are submitted to ResDAC, and that initiates the review process here that's on the slide. This looks pretty linear, but each step may require correspondence with ResDAC. So it's best if you don't submit materials right before you're starting leave. I know that sometimes happens, like you're in a rush to get things done and then you submit, but that can slow down review since we are often asking questions. ResDAC will confirm receipt of request materials. We'll verify that a request packet's complete in an intake review. And then the next step is technical review. And in that review, we'll review a subset of documents to finalize kind of the ones that are focused on research descriptions and the data request. So we'll work with the data distributor to obtain a cost invoice. And once everything's kind of complete, the RIF application with the research description set, the data request is set. The last step in technical review is asking for formal confirmation of the cost invoice. After that, ResDAC administrative review checks all the documents for consistency. This also includes verification of the DMP-SAQ if a project has physical data. And then when everything's deemed complete, we'll ask for signatures on final documents. When everything's returned, it goes through one last final review to make sure that whatever was signed matched what we asked to be signed, and then things get submitted to CMS. CMS Privacy Board reviews all requests for compliance with federal law and CMS data policies. Requests might also undergo additional review at CMS. There's the Data Governance Board that reviews all innovator requests in addition to Privacy Board. That's really focused on whether the product, tool, or analyses could exploit beneficiaries or create the potential for fraud or abuse in CMS programs. Some federal requests may also require review by the Office of Enterprise Data and Analytics Chief Data Officer. So those are additional steps that go along with Privacy Board review. Once a project's approved, CMS sends a decision notification and payment instructions via email. And then CMS also needs to be notified when payment has been submitted. As a last step on the CMS side, the DUA status is set to approved when they're able to confirm payment, and that initiates data processing. So from that step, the project's forwarded to the data distributor to get everything set up. So if you have any questions about the RIF request process, don't hesitate to reach out to us or look at resources on our website. We have a lot of resources focused on the request process, including information on requester types that's really set by organization. We have the things that are designed to help understand the data. We mostly discussed that yesterday. We have a forms generator that can be used to download request documentation depending on just a couple questions. And then when you download the forms from the forms generator, you'll also get associated instructions. And the instructions documents are annotated versions of the forms that cover expectations. And I think these are an underutilized resource. I definitely recommend looking at the instructions within those instructions documents when you're filling out the forms. Our website also has all the resources for an amendment request, or if you're trying to make changes to an established study on something called our project management page. So after a data use agreement's in place, at minimum, you'll need to follow the steps to close your request when the study is complete. Most likely, you'll also be doing more things over the course or duration of your study. Other changes include modifying personnel, modifying VRDC access, updating data, updating your study description. All of those changes have different requirements. Since different things are getting changed, different forms are required. So we have instructions for all those different scenarios, and then those forms also get submitted to ResDAC and go through a review process that can be shorter or extended depending on how many things are getting changed in a request. DUAs also require an annual extension with CMS. This lets CMS know that you're continuing the project. So you do have to submit a message to CMS annually to say, yes, I'm still following the data use agreement. I'm still conducting this project that I originally described, to make sure you're in good standing. And then VRDC access also requires annual renewals. Like I said, a lot of those fees are annually renewable. So for VRDC projects, you're probably also having to submit an annual amendment request to manage VRDC access. If you ever have questions about the process to establish a DUA or manage a DUA, you can contact our help desk. Again, we have a technical advisor on phones from 8 to 4 Central Time on weekdays. You can also send us an email or let us know if you have any questions.